Welcome to USC Rossier's Leadership Month and today's webinar, our follow-up discussion on what's next for education in California. Before we begin, I'd like to review the process for submitting a question for our panelists. Please type your question in the Q&A box that can be accessed by clicking on the Q&A icon located at the bottom of your screen. We have reserved time towards the end of the webinar for your questions and hope to get to as many as possible. We also received a number of questions via the registration form and have tried to incorporate as many of them as possible into our structured Q&A at the beginning of this session. If you're planning to share your experience at today's session on social media, we encourage you to include the Leadership Month hashtag Rossier Leads, which appears at the top of the screen. Lastly, please note a recording of this webinar will be available in the next few days and a link will be sent via email. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator. Dr. David Cash earned his EdD from USC Rossier in 2008 and currently serves as Professor of Education at USC Rossier. And at this point, I will turn the session over to you, Dave.
Well, thank you very much, Matt. And it's a pleasure to be here again this afternoon. Boy, the context of today's webinar is very different in many, many ways than it was the last time that we were able to meet. It has been 3 months since we were fortunate to have these three education leaders with us discussing the pandemic, and that was on April 23rd. We shut schools, we appeared to maybe open them, and now we, I guess, shut them again for most counties in California. We have a budget now for 2021 and an outlook for the 21-22 budget. We have state guidance, but no real state directives where locals are still kind of left to fend for themselves. The politicization of masks and opening of schools and businesses has become very significant. And unfortunately, we have had very recently a huge uptick in the identification of COVID-19, hospitalization of sick people, and our death rate has continued to climb. With that as our context, I'd like to introduce our panelists today. We're very fortunate to have three great leaders in education. Wes Smith, the Executive Director of AXA. Wes is a former superintendent of several school districts, and he has day-to-day involvement with TK to 12 at the national level, the state of California level, and working with local superintendents. We also have Paul Gothold, who is the superintendent of the San Diego County Office of Education. Paul is also a former school district superintendent, and he is recognized across the state as a leader in education. And lastly, but not least, we have Jay Westover. Jay Westover is recognized throughout the nation as a thought leader in education. He's an author and consultant to hundreds of schools in California. Really want to thank the three of you for again joining us this afternoon and providing us with your insight on what's next in K-12 education for the state of California. Our first question goes to Dr. Wes Smith. Wes, as you speak and listen around the state, how are school districts reopening for the 2021 school year, and what factors are influencing those decisions?
Thanks, Dr. Cash. Let me also thank you and Rossier for putting this together. What a great benefit to the field. I also want to thank Jay for the great work they're doing to support districts. And Paul, my friend and ally, I don't know that more people are involved in this work at the state level relative to reopening than Paul. I know that the CDE leaned on him heavily, and much of what we see as supports and metrics came from San Diego County. So it's an honor to be with all of you. You know, I want to start with what are we looking at, what's influencing it first, and then get into what are we seeing around the state. And you hit on some of these things already, Dr. Cash. You know, data, guidelines, guidance, politics, and a real recent push by labor are really influencing this. These decisions are changing not just by the day, but by the minute. All around the state, people are negotiating, working through plans, and reworking plans. When we talk about the data, you know, we opened pretty early in California, and then we behaved irresponsibly. I'm sure nobody on this webinar, of course, I'm sure you were all great, but a lot of Californians weren't. And so we've seen alarming spikes and trends in data, and that has influenced parents and educators alike. So in April, when we were hopeful that our good behavior would lead to a more positive reopening, that data is discouraging a lot of folks now. We see guidelines that come out that intend to help, but they often confuse people. With the most recent CDPH guidelines and the governor saying that folks on the county watch list can't reopen physically, even though that can't is a guideline, discourages about 32 of the counties and then all of their districts. So even if they had planned on a physical reopening or a blended or hybrid model, now they're worried about doing so and going against the guidance of the governor and CDPH. Politics, as you mentioned, are alive and well, as they always are. We've had superintendents around this state, and not just one or two, receive death threats. You heard me right, death threats for following science guidelines, because even those have become hyper politicized. I'm hopeful that with recent pivots in the White House, that maybe those won't be as political, certainly as it relates to face coverings and the like. But politics have made a big play here. And then shortly after, we had the budget deal with the signing of SB 98. We saw that labor sent a letter to the governor basically saying it wasn't safe to come back to school. You know, so we really worked hard through the budget process to say that we couldn't, with the May revise, safely reopen schools. And then as the data got worse, folks get very, very alarmed. And not just labor in California, but we saw NEA, AFT, and others pushing hard on this in all the states. And then we saw what happened when Los Angeles Unified and San Diego Unified made that joint statement about opening virtually only. So those things have changed, and they've even changed for folks that had plans in place. And I would say this, it's all over the board, but you'll see most of the districts in California opening 100% virtually in the fall because of all of those things we just mentioned. Now, know that not all counties are like Los Angeles County. There are some smaller rural counties where the data aren't the same, and so they're going to open in a hybrid model. You're not hearing a lot of 100% openings, but we are hearing of some counties that are able to do the hybrid model, but most will be opening in this virtual environment. And I know we're going to talk more about that in a bit, but that's what we're seeing.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Smith. Appreciate that. Let's have Dr. Gothold also respond to what he's learning about how schools are reopening. And then, Dr. Gothold, I've got a couple other questions for you. How are districts addressing academic, social, emotional learning and safety needs? And then, as a recognized leader, not just in San Diego County, but in the state, what advice are you giving your districts that you speak with?
Okay, so that's a lot. Well, first and foremost, to echo what Dr. Smith said about Rossier taking the lead on making these webinars available for folks out in the field, I think is just incredible. And Wes, as you mentioned, my brother, my ally, working side by side, fighting a lot of these battles together. And Jay, thanks for all that you do. Long time standing working relationship with Jay for, geez, 20 years or so. Wes tackled the bulk of your first question. I think the only thing that I would add to it is that there's still, you know, regardless of how you feel about what came out from the governor's office, I am grateful that they just, at least from a state health perspective, made a decision about what the metric was. I mean, goodness, I'm not an epidemiologist. The doctor in front of my name does not profile me or qualify me to practice medicine or know anything about what is related to disease, COVID, and everything else. we really do need, whatever, good, bad, or indifferent, agree or disagree, just some non-negotiables from a health perspective to take away the politics, but also to take away individual decisions of what we think is best in that environment. Because I'm still very much unclear of what is safe and what isn't. And that's because this thing continues to evolve, quite frankly. So to have at least some metrics and guidelines about when it is safe to reopen, when to close, I think is valuable, whether however you feel about it. I will say that, and I applaud the governor for making a decision on that. I think that does help to a certain degree. As Wes mentioned, sometimes it brings about more questions than answers, and really the asterisk on that last executive order, you know, the waiver process for elementary schools. So what does that mean? Because is that for the rural schools who are already in operation? Does that include everybody? I can just give an example in San Diego County alone, two very different districts. San Isidro, which is a border town, very small district, handful of schools. That community is faced with a surge and an outbreak that's over 2,000 cases. Carlsbad on the north end, 13 square miles, much bigger, 130,000 residents. They have made, at last I checked, 70 cases in that entire community. So what is that threshold? Because the edict, the decision now is based countywide. We're all lumped in, whether you're in a hot spot or not. And one of the things that concerns me is that, you know, the kids arguably that need the most help are in those regions where we have those hot spots, right? And so I'm not clear about how this waiver process is going to work. Are they going to use the same statewide metrics for the local agencies to follow, that if you're within the 5% range, you can open up? And obviously, as Wes alluded to before, that's contingent upon agreement with parent groups, with your bargaining units and everything else. So there's a lot to be sorted out in a very short amount of time with respect to that. That's a big topic right now in our county amongst our superintendents about how we can open even under the conditions that the governor has outlined. I would say from an academic perspective, you know, from day one, we went into recovery in March. And what is this going to look like when we come back? And you know what I continuously have to go back to, and friends have reminded me about this, is, you know, why are we in public education? What is the ultimate goal? And for me, and for a lot of us, it's that social justice lens. It's educational justice. It's the moral imperative preparing every kid for college, where every student should have high expectations and the supports underneath. How does that translate into the environment you're in? What we had mentioned to our districts and really focused on, you know, double down on distance learning, double down on your most vulnerable. What does that look like in this environment? Be prepared for every contingency and be prepared to pivot back and forth because of the possibility of further closures. What I don't want to see missing, and what I'm concerned about the most when you talk about academics, we have to have those instructional targets, those goals for kids, how we're progress monitoring, how we're measuring whether they're meeting those standards or not, and providing support underneath. What I saw a lot of in the distance learning and when we shut down was simply materials and websites for kids to go to and do busy work. And that's not going to change the lives of our kids, not to mention the digital divide and everything else. So, and I would say that, you know, for the social emotional piece, I'm sorry, you asked a lot of questions. I'm going to answer. Our agency was selected by CDE to take the lead on a suicide prevention program that came out of AB 1808. And we have a bank of resources. So we are tackling this probably in 4 different dimensions. We're working with Scripps and Rady's, our local children's hospital and healthcare system, to deploy social workers, psychologists, healthcare professionals to those kids that need additional support. We have a script that our teachers read at least twice a week that just as a checkpoint, it's a welfare check. And if any of these answers trigger something different, we deploy the necessary supports with our partners. We have required our teachers to do 2 social emotional lessons a week just to help students self-regulate, deal with the anxiety. And finally, the biggest piece that came out of 1808 with the suicide prevention, there's an app that's free and available to any student statewide. And it really gets down to support for kids at a digital level. It can be done on a phone. And our office is training and providing these resources to the other 57 counties across the state. And then finally, I'll end the question with this. I am really trying to make sure that we put race relations, our underserved kids, our Black kids at the forefront of everything we do. We just had a student webinar last week where we had Black kids from across our county, facilitated by students, talking about racism, talking about bias, and our kids said they're disengaged, they don't feel respected, they're invisible. They wish the adults would value them, take more time to learn about them, and see themselves in a positive light, not from a deficit perspective. And it'll bring you to tears, but I'm capturing this in 5 minutes, as well as the other webinars and work we're doing through our equity department. I'm sharing it with the superintendents. I said, this has to be part of your orientation to bring teachers back. We cannot miss an opportunity where people are actually talking about this a little more. There's more interest, but we need to use it as a gateway to change the lives of our kids. I do not want to just come back and focus on how we're presenting, instruction and this, that, and the other, without really making sure that we're paying attention to our kids that are still disenfranchised from our system.
Well, thank you, Dr. Gothold. I would expect nothing less from you, knowing you and your perspective and focus on social justice, and very much appreciated. And I think, as Dr. Kendi would say, we're either a racist or an anti-racist, and so let's be anti-racist, and when we can, talk about racism and the racism that exists in our schools. So bravo for tackling that. Appreciate it very much. Our next question goes to Jay Westover. So Jay, if most or a majority of our districts will have either a hybrid model or be 100% distance learning, how are districts or schools creating clear priorities to inform teaching and student learning, and what could they be doing?
Well, I'd like to frame that just a little bit differently. But first of all, I want to thank you all for letting me be on here with you. It's an honor, and I think we are making a difference. When you say priorities, what I notice happening now is like an instructional pacing guide or a learning loss priority. But when you talk to principals and teachers, the biggest question is, what is my week going to look like? What is my day going to look like? And so I think that the challenge we face now is that teachers are 3 to 4 weeks away from going back to school, and they're not really certain about what it's going to look like. And so I think if we shift the idea of priorities away from like learning loss or instructional priorities, I'd maybe advocate for 4 that we've kind of attended to through our work over the years. The idea of clarity focus probably is more like an instructional framework. Think about curriculum instruction, assessment, learning environment, social emotional support. Have we shaped that in a way in which teachers and principals have at least a framework? And then instead of thinking about a school year, I've been advocating for 3 weeks. What's the first 3 weeks of school going to look like? How can you have your principals and teachers talk about the first 3 weeks? What's the curricular resources that make sense, instructional strategies, assessment of learning, social emotional support? And let's get that right, or build some confidence so we can start the school year with some strength, at least some excitement. And then maybe for a district, we might say there's a 9-week check-in point. Let's give schools some space and maybe have a 3-week instructional cycle. The challenge I'm seeing now is district leaders feel that they have to get it right. So they're scrambling to create everything for school sites, but the school sites don't know what to do with it. So what there is an absence of, I wouldn't say is priorities, it might be a sense of shared leadership. So have we decided how we're going to collaborate with the principals and put them in charge and guide them and give them opportunity to lead and figure this out with us? Do they have their school leadership teams in place? When I talk to most principals, they're just barely doing weekly engagement with their schools. They haven't decided how to lead with their staff yet, Well, who are the key leaders? And so if we were to say the first weeks of school, 3 weeks might look like this, our instructional framework would include these really key resources. Let's give our schools the space they need to figure out how to implement, deploy, and let's have our principals come back and share, here's how we're going to pull off the first 3 weeks. Let's share it with our colleagues within our own district. Let's feel confident about it. Let's work out some tweaks. We got 3 or 4 weeks to do that. Then I think those priorities become more about confidence. And then I think there's 2 other pieces. One would be this idea of collective expertise. I think about Michael Fullen's idea of professional capital. You have to have individual capital, social capital, and decisional capital. Well, if you want expertise, Hattie's research says all those 3 things come down to a collaborative inquiry cycle. So we might say, and it's a stretch, in every school in my district, I'd like to have a sense of learning gain or loss every 3 weeks. What are you going to attend to? How are you going to do it? How are you going to measure it? And I'd like to be able to check in with each school on a 3-week basis to understand what's working, what's not working, do some cross-lateral sharing so elementary schools don't get too far away from each other. And then what is interesting is a lot of my superintendent friends are posting on Twitter, I'm going to do this, would love to talk to someone else about it. I'm like, so we have to have a really strong collaborative inquiry cycle within district and across districts. You know, Dr. Gothold, you're well positioned, and I'm sure you're already doing it. And Dr. Smith, you know, it's what you do as the state. So how do we not build expertise of an individual, but how do we build expertise across the district? And then lastly, I would just say that we have to have a continuous improvement model in place where we have to choose the evidence. What's the evidence of impact? Some might go back to the work of Deming, Plan, Do, Study, Act as a cycle. We always use analyze what is in front of you, design what you're going to do, implement it, and refine it. But if we have an improvement process in place, instead of us trying to figure out how to get it right on day 1, what if we were to say every 3 weeks we will be better, we will learn more, we will share it, we will make each of our schools better, and as we get stronger as a school and a district, we have a way to share with our colleague districts so we're not in this individually. So when I think of priorities, I'll just recap them. I think we need clarity of focus so everyone in the school understands what that instructional framework is. I think we have to have a way to have shared leadership so we're working together on it, structures and processes. I think we have to have an inquiry-driven process so we're learning in 3-week cycles to get better together. And I think that sharing of improvement has to be lateral within a school and across school districts. I mention that because what I'm mainly hearing now is MOU. What I'm mainly hearing now is what's the weekly schedule. What I'm mainly hearing now is what's the daily schedule. And what I'm hearing from principals and teachers is, I appreciate the framework. I don't know how to fill the day. I don't know what to do with kids. So in other words, we're seeing districts provide guidance, but it definitely is not enough. And I'm wondering if we're focused too much on logistics and structures, and we're not focused enough on building expertise. Some districts are doing it well, but I think we're a little bit too trapped in the politics of collaborative expertise instead of the actual implementation and execution of it.
Well, thank you very much, Jay. Boy, that leads right into this next question for both Dr. Smith and Dr. Gothold. The issue of quality instruction for distance learning is huge. I mean, we've heard it from the governor, heard it from parents, and it's just everywhere. So what are you learning about how districts are guaranteeing high quality, effective distance learning for every student, particularly the students that Dr. Gothold spoke about, those that were traditionally disengaged?
Well, I'll tell you this, you know, for us is the second most important question that our professionals are engaging. The first is how are we going to keep our students, staff, and community safe? So safety first. And then how do we ensure quality so that especially our underserved and underrepresented don't fall further behind. AXA, from the beginning, we've been advocating for the state to step up and establish state standards for public health guidelines, to Dr. Gothold's point. And we also applaud their efforts to do so, and try to muddle through some of the confusing things like what is a cohort, but we appreciate the attempts. But I think something that Jay was mentioning, we've been calling for as well, and that is for the state to say these are essential or necessary standards. Let's set the framework for what students must learn at each grade level, in each subject, if you will, for this school year. And if we want to start with 3 weeks, that's cool. But let's start with, what do we expect them to learn? Because if we expect them to do everything they've always done in these new realities, we lose before you begin. And we need the state to articulate that. And so we've been calling for that. We've been calling for clarity around daily, meaningful instruction. Both Dr. Gothold and Jay mentioned what high quality looks like. It's direct instruction. It's progress monitoring with interventions, right? It's daily feedback. I mean, we know how to do this, and yet we're not speaking much to those specifics in the state. And where I don't disagree with what Jay is saying, I think, you know, we need to start with the what, and then we need to make sure people are trained up. And people right now, I think, are having a lot of conversations about what that looks like. How do we get folks trained in a short amount of time to do this work? But all of these things become political, and one can hope to, or aspire to, pray for the ability to move towards these things and be compelled to sit at a table and talk about other things. And so we can't deny that there are these political relationships that we have to entertain. And I would say more than that, work through so that we're better because of the effort. I think some of the concerns we have as we look out there right now, and I know Paul's going to jump on this, but when we called for the state to require high quality synchronous instruction, what we saw in SB 98 wasn't that. When the governor recently talked about the CDPH guidelines, and he said, we want instruction that is as rigorous as in-person instruction. It's nice to say that. It's a heck of a soundbite. But when you look at what the legislation says, it doesn't call for that. In fact, it calls for, and this is a quote, daily live interaction. Daily live interaction is not by definition high quality instruction. It means that I can sign in, take a role for my students, give them a fight on, sign out. We have examples around the state right now where people are suggesting that they will give 20 minutes a day of synchronous instruction, and then the rest of the instruction is passive. It's those students doing work. It's what Paul described earlier. And while we were in a crisis and people moved in that direction out of necessity before, we should be better than that now. And our students, especially our students with great needs, deserve more than 20 minutes of synchronous instruction. Right? And the state doesn't compel them to do that. In fact, when it talks about minimum instruction, it's 3 hours for kinder, 3 hours and 50 minutes for 1st through 3rd, 4 hours for 4th through 12th grade. But it's live interaction and work with the time value of. So you could have a 1-minute intro and then 2 hours and 59 minutes of busy work online or filling out packets. And I would just suggest that if we're about equity, if we're student advocates, we've got to advocate for more than that. And I can tell you, kind of similar, Dr. Cash, to what you asked in the first question, what are we seeing out there? We're seeing things all over the place. I know of some instances where folks are getting 5 hours a day of synchronous instruction, with even time after that they're communicating with their families. I applaud those folks. In many instances, their agreements have the folks coming to work, and they're teaching from their teaching environments where they have the equipment, where they have the resources, not at home in their living rooms like me. And that can't happen everywhere. No one's saying it has to be the requirement, but it is happening around. And for those folks that would throw out the red herring that, well, if it's not safe to bring students, it's not safe to bring adults. No, that's a false comparison. 31 people in a classroom versus one person in a classroom are very, very different dynamics. So we see differences out there. We also have today, the one I shared with you is not a made up example. It's a real example. 20 minutes of synchronous. The rest is online, busy work. I have a superintendent I just talked to this morning in a very prestigious district that almost had agreement to have 4 hours a day. And because of certain pressures, they're about ready to agree to no defined number of minutes. And again, I would say if we're about quality, and people on this webinar know what quality looks like, we're not going to get it with those types of activities. I don't know, Paul, I know this is one that, you've been chatting with me about a lot, so maybe I'll just stop there. And, you're at the ground level doing a lot of this work. Let you chime in.
Before we hear from Paul, I want to ask you a question, Wes.
Yeah.
Statewide, so it sounds like the legislation was so general that we're still left with each local school district having to determine what that means, thus resulting in that anywhere from 1 minute to 4 hours worth of synchronous instruction memorandum of understanding with their teachers association.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And this is where we get to, in fairness, what Paul said. Let's be grateful for the attempts to clarify through state guidelines or directives. I would just say we don't go far enough.
On the health side. Health side.
No. But I think even on the health side, while I appreciate it, the issue of cohorts is mind-boggling to everybody, because districts think it's about student cohorts. It's not. It could be labor cohorts. It could be cohorts within labor cohorts. And so how do you define 5% of something that isn't defined? It's an impossibility that chills our efforts to get back to work. And so I think in academics, we have that same thing. Look, SB 98 and AB 77 before that were all an attempt by the legislature to say, hey, look, we gave you more money, right? You didn't like the May revise, folks. You said you couldn't open schools physically, safely, with the resources provided by the May revise, so we gave you more. We didn't hold you harmless. That's a misnomer, because people who are growing are held harmless. But we froze your funding, right? 1920 levels again for 2021, right? We did that for you. We gave you some additional flexibilities. Now we want high quality instruction. But why they say that, it's almost like they don't have the courage to go that next step and require it. Call it out and require it. So Dr. Cash, you're absolutely right. And that's why I think, Jay, I think what you're saying is not wrong, but I know out there in over 1,000 districts, they're having to make these decisions locally. They're very political decisions. There are a lot of folks with influence on those decisions. They want to open schools. And I can tell you, most folks right now don't have approved plans for doing so. And that's alarming.
Wow. Well, we would like to hear from Paul, and I want to thank Jay. We need somebody like him shouting at us to tell us what we should be doing. So I appreciate that very much. So Paul, would love to hear your perspective. Thank you.
I think Wes just about covered it. I will add this. I will say that, Jay's right. If you have a model, an instructional design in your school, it shouldn't matter what environment we're in. We just simply pivot, because those expectations, those instructional targets, the manner in which we're monitoring progress are already in place. That should be something that's fluid. What it speaks to is that lack of planning, lack of coherence, if they struggle with trying to figure out what you're going to do with kids. And I hope I'm not out of bounds with this, Jay, but I think that if that design is in place, it shouldn't matter the environment. It really shouldn't. To echo what Wes said, we talked a lot about this, because when that language came out and consulting with some of my colleagues, friends, and folks here at the office, we were really concerned about that word interaction, because that absolutely does not lend itself to high quality instruction. What are you doing? What did you do over the weekend? Are you having trouble with this assignment or that assignment? We know what kids are going to benefit from when the research is said and done. And we were massively concerned about being in a full-time distance learning environment with that terminology. And so again, my fear, are we going to have a race to the bottom, or the race to the least common denominator, or the easiest way out? And that's just to provide some assignments every single day to our kids without those really specific targeted goals that our kids need and deserve. You know, the other thing that we've been pressing on with this, and it's still an uphill battle, I still, for the life of me, just do not understand why we continue to track kids, why we continue to provide different courses for different children based on adults' perceptions of what they can and cannot do. Can we get out of, you know, offering courses that are not A through G, because it's not going to serve them? The diploma doesn't mean as much. And really pushing on those elements in your calendar of guaranteeing, demanding every child has access to core, and then the appropriate supports underneath. This environment, without those structures and expectations, the expectations then drop again. And so, you know, doubling down on our efforts to reach our kids. I can tell you in San Diego County, we just wrote some more grants. 1 out of 5 kids in this county did not have access to the internet at all. It's over 100,000 students. And so while our folks have done some heroic efforts, and I got to commend Cox and Spectrum. I mean, they have a lot of programs already, but the manner in which you apply for this is laborious. Our undocumented families and low-income families are uncomfortable navigating this. We've actually come to an agreement where we, as the education entity, can serve as the intermediary, and then the school districts just tell them who needs it. They're going to go and install it. There's no pressure on the families. But this is going to take some time as well. So as Wes had mentioned, you know, what is that definition of high quality instruction? What are the expectations for each one of our kids at every grade level? Districts who already had that in place are not struggling with this transition. That's most important.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul. I'm going to stay with you for this next question. So as you work with district leaders around San Diego County and the state, what would help those leaders make decisions about reopening in the safest possible way? Let's say we get to a spot where we are doing something other than distance learning. And, you know, when we met last in April, your office had created a template for planning that's been used all across the state. And what, if anything, has changed on that template for us to know about?
Well, the politics, like Wes said, I mean, yeah, the death threats are real. The threatening emails are real. We get plenty of them, and it's on all sides of it. You know, when we set course, we really said, be prepared for every contingency. What does school look like with these health conditions in place if you bring your kids back? What about 50% on campus? What about this? So really, they've had some time to really sit through this with their teams. I think our staff did an incredibly great job working with health and coming up, because our guidance doesn't just say, here's what it actually tells you how to do it. There's sample schedules. There's you know, the research and the information on the back end if you want to get further into why it is the way it is. But, you know, we just revised it based on the governor order. Now we know 3 through 12 have to wear masks. That's a requirement. That's now in our guidance. And I can tell you that, you know, the politics are different throughout this county, and our superintendents differ on bringing kids back right now. And I can tell you that there are day camps going on right now. There are still one of the things we fought for, because at the elementary level, we were really pushing. We wanted every kid back, and there is a way to do it with really small classrooms, deploying your after school staff during the day. That was something that we were really adamant about. We wanted flexibility, continuous funding for after school program, but allow them to be part of the instructional design at the school. Teacher delivers the lesson. Kids are working with our after school group, professionals in groups of 10 to 12, and got really creative about finding solutions, you know, to engage and keep our kids on campus with all of those health measures in place. So I stand by our guidance. I think it is sound, and I think it gives also a little bit of autonomy for schools and districts to look at. As well, this doesn't apply to me, but these are the parameters we need to look at, and it gives you a template. It gives you a blueprint. It's available to anyone who wants it. I would just like to throw one other thing in, if I may. If I'm talking too long, you can cut me off. You know, one of the interesting challenges we found when we talk about high quality instruction reopening, about 2 years ago, our office became really engaged with Baja and the Mexican consulate, because policy changes. We had a number of our kids who were American born land in Mexico because of these reasons, parents, deportation, whatever the case may be. And the Mexican educational system was struggling teaching American born kids English as a second language. They had never had to deal with that, because most of the majority of kids did not speak Spanish. And so we had been providing that PD to teachers, working closely with them, as well as a number of our binational kids. Well, just recently, that number, because of the economic strain, policy, COVID, is 40,000 kids in Baja California alone that are American-born kids. Now, and part of the problem was, for particularly high school kids, they were dropping out of school in Mexico, working for the tourism industry in hotels, because they were disengaged. And now that the tourism has stopped, you know, now that there's an influx of new kids, they're expecting more. We're in the process of our multilingual division of building a transnational school, so that for those kids who may come back, regardless if they do or not, we can provide a high quality, rigorous instruction here or over there. They're congruent, and if the kids do migrate back and forth, there's no loss of credits, there's a clear articulation, and they'll actually get a diploma from 2 different countries if we're able to pull this off. But that's really a focus of our work. The majority of the 40,000 are from California, and a lot of them obviously from San Diego. So that's something we're also working on, that just was created because of this environment we're in as well.
Wow, that's exciting. Geez, that's really fantastic. Thank you for doing that work. Appreciate it very much. So Jay, from your seat, you talked about developing the collective expertise to ensure high quality teaching and learning. How will that change, do you think, if we stay in this 100% distance learning for an extended period of time, let's say maybe even an entire school year?
Well, I'm listening to the conversation broadly, and I can't help but go right to the idea that this comes down to leadership and culture in your district. If you have a school district that embraces teacher collaboration and expertise and wants to maximize that Wednesday or Friday and really make sure that we're improving, and you have principals and district leaders that want to put in place a structure and push back against politics, we're going to see amazing work within school districts. But if we have a school district with a culture that doesn't embrace what needs to happen to build expertise, which is really strong, deep collaboration, people learning from each other in a structured manner, thinking about high quality instruction with evidence of learning and expertise, I think that we're going to see MOUs in school districts and school site cultures that kind of go to the least path of resistance. And so I don't want to say that we don't have strong leaders. I don't want to say that we don't have strong school district cultures, but I'm seeing the conversation focus on logistics and structures. And I'm not seeing the conversation talk about the leadership we need at the local level, at the school level, and how do we develop people to take on the work? And how do we really move away from what PLCs may have become, which was like a Wednesday event? And how do we make them what they need to be? I work with a lot of school districts, and they say, this is our opportunity. Everything we wanted to do, we now have a reason to do it. And I'm like, great, let's go. And then all of a sudden, we see some cultural barriers pop up. And all of a sudden, we see other things you're describing pop up. And they're like, well, it's an opportunity, but I'm not sure if we can. So I appreciate, the idea of a statewide guidance, but I think even when we have it, it still comes down to how are we building the leadership we need at the district level and the site level to really do the deep, hard work is places where it exists, they're going to be fine. Places where it doesn't, they're not. So I'm wondering, it's a question rather than an answer, Dr. Cash, how do we begin to really focus on that leadership development? And how do we begin to prioritize collaboration as not a structure or a negotiated item, but more for a way to build the expertise we need? Because I think people are craving for it. Teachers I work with want it. I just think there's a void. And if we can push back against the politics and other things happening and create space to really go into leadership and culture for at least a period of time that's needed to get things in place, I think we'll be successful. I don't think we push back against the politics and the other things that are happening to allow the leadership conversations to occur. So I'm going to leave that as an open question. How do you push back against that which is not going to make a difference and begin to promote leadership and cultural change and really productive collaboration?
Yeah, Jay, I think I can only speak for myself and what we're doing here at the county office, but I say over and over to my colleagues here that I work with and also the superintendents, our job is to depoliticize all of this and just make the right thing the right thing. Our office is one of the, I think one of 2 or 3 in the state that actually has a leadership strand where you can get your tiered administrative credential through a county office of ed as opposed to a college. And it's approved by the CTC. So all the things that you're mentioning that are massively important, along with that equity lens and everything else, I tell people all the time, you know, the investment in leadership has to be threefold. It's recruitment and it's training and it's support. And too often, if we have an opportunity here to build that leadership pipeline that knows where to push on those buttons and not deviate because it is the right thing, it is absolutely imperative that that's the position we take. We do that here in our office because that's part of our culture. It's just what we do. And we have a split board 3-2, but at the end of the day, you know, they're only split on one issue, but they are united in our approach to how we support kids and everything we do at the office. So if you can imagine, you know, how would you call it? There is a huge fight right now around incarceration, police activity, and everything else. And just as an example, in our office 3 years ago, we had 600 kids incarcerated throughout this county, all Black and brown, of course. So there's a racial profile, criminalization, and we decided to take it on. And we told our board, this is what we're doing. This is why. We work with the juvenile court system. So these are judges. This is probation, the district attorney's office, law enforcement, you name it. We built these achievement centers, and in lieu of incarceration, because we know once a kid is locked up once, there is a tremendous likelihood they become part of the system. A tremendous likelihood they become repeat offenders. Long story short, you know, in lieu of incarceration, we take them into our achievement centers. There's wraparound services, there's counseling, we feed them. They're in school 7 till 9 at night. And with all the supports in the world, we figure out what the issues are. We work with the family, get the kid on their feet, get them back into the district schools. We have not had one repeat offender that has gone through this program. We have 166 kids incarcerated right now in this entire county. The entire county. That was not a popular position to take on in this county, to say we're going to de-incarcerate all our kids. But it was the right thing to do. We wanted to provide alternatives to detention. The right thing is the right thing. And I think when it comes to hiring, we have to figure out what people are all about. I've said this over and over. I can teach a principal Common Core till I'm blue in the face. I can teach them how to be better principals and logistics and everything else. I cannot always teach them how to be courageous, how to fight for the right things. I need to know what's growing inside you that lights that fire in the belly where you're gonna do whatever it takes to help our kids no matter what. That has to be the focus when we decide who we're putting in these key positions to move the needle for our kids.
Well said. Thank you, Paul. Well said. We got a number of questions from our audience today. So I'm going to ask them and just chime in. So the first one is, so prior to COVID-19, most children used computers and tablets for completely different things at home, primarily entertainment. Now that the fall is starting online for most schools, how can educators help change the mindset children have for technology, shifting the concept of usage from entertainment to learning, and in a way that promotes digital citizenship and independent learning?
You know, I'll just jump in briefly on that one. I think that change might have to start with the adults that use technology. I'll just give a very personal example. My wife's been teaching third grade for 27 years now. And as we speak, she's in the other room learning how to use Google Classroom. And she coordinated with her colleagues the other day, you know, and it's kind of a struggle, but then every once in a while I hear her say, wow, that is really cool. That's going to make it so much better. So I think that if we want our students to really realize the potential of acceleration through technology, we may have to then first figure out, as educators who educate kids, how do we harness it? Because I think we're going to have to educate our kids, but we know that our kids don't get better before us getting better on the effective use of technology. So I might flip the question and say, how might we become more savvy at using technology as classroom teachers and administrators so that students see the value and really the opportunity?
Great. Wes, Paul?
No, I think Jay nailed it. You know, we've got to really invest in our human capital, as you said earlier. Train folks up so they can inspire growth in students, and not just inspire, but help facilitate students getting better at their use. You know, I think because I have to, or get to, deal so much at the state and federal level. I mean, there are great efforts there to kind of narrow some of those gaps. Paul mentioned this a while back, the disparity of access in just one county, and they exist everywhere. You know, the state superintendent, the first partner, they've been working on devices and hotspots. I think it's worth noting that, once again, kudos to Rossier, the Center for Engagement-Driven Global Education, Alan Arkatab. They're putting together in July this summit where they're bringing broadband providers to the table, and they're saying devices are one thing. We've got to get access, and it's got to be free, or it's got to be affordable for every student in California. And so there's some powerful things happening right now that this crisis we've reframed into an opportunity to improve the system. And I think these are necessary steps as we answer the question.
Great. Thank you. Paul, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I just ditto what they said. I would also say if either of you can help me with my 5-year-old, she's good for 10 minutes on Zoom, and that's it. It's working horribly.
Oh boy. Another question from our audience is one that I asked, I think is a really good one as well. How can teachers build relationships with our parents and our children through distance learning when we're separated in space?
Can I take a crack at this, Jay?
Please do.
Dr. Cash. You know, we have, as you may or may not know, county offices support all the districts, but we also run our own programs. And those are for our most vulnerable kids, either incarcerated, community schools, pregnant teens. We actually have a very successful school for the homeless that's supported by a project and foundation that it just pumps a ton of money into wraparound services and everything else. And when we had to pivot, you know, for the majority of our kids, the vast majority of them, we needed hotspots because they're transient, some live in the car, shelters, Section 8 housing. It's really a mixed bag. But what's interesting about this environment, because we did have expectations. The principal is a great leader, and teachers were teaching and doing a multitude of things with their kids. It, particularly for our younger ones, it forced the parents to come online with them, and it became actually a vehicle for stronger parent engagement in this environment. It actually had it was a good unintended consequence that parents that told us through this process that how much they admire and respect their teachers because of just how much they cared, how much they were teaching them. They understood learning concepts. It was truly a remarkable thing to see our parents and staff talk about this and actually capture it on video, but they became so much more engaged in their child's education in this environment as a result of distance learning.
Wow, thank you.
Hey, Dr. Cash, I would add too that, look, if the will is there, the tools are there. Look at every example we have right now of how people on this webinar have figured out a way for themselves to do this very thing. Was it a graduation of one of their relatives that is no longer a physical graduation? Is it someone in the hospital that you can't go see, so you figure out a way to connect with them? I can tell you that few people in the world are more technologically illiterate than my parents. My dad still has a flip phone because he doesn't trust the other phones. He has never taken a photo on anything or from anything other than a camera with actual film, right? But my sister had her 50th birthday during this shelter in place. I sent them a Chromebook with pictures of how to turn it on, how to get onto Zoom. And in 2 attempts, we had a virtual birthday party for my sister with folks who are afraid of technology. We have these examples everywhere. We solve for those things we care about. So if the will is there, the tools are there to engage our students, our parents, our coworkers.
I'd just like to add to what you just mentioned there. So maybe if we embrace context as much as content. So for example, we're going to teach math or English. There's a tendency to just be regimentary with how we teach it. An example that's real life, like you just mentioned, Dr. Smith, is I came across a teacher who said I need to teach proportions and fractions, but I don't know how to do it virtually. I wonder if I ask my kids, I'd like you next time we meet to teach us how to make some recipe, but you have to use proportions, fractions, ratios. Every kid talked to the parents and said, I need to teach my classmates how to make something. I like to eat this. Could you help me get this ready so I can share with them the proportions or ratios? And so before you know it, you had like the family involved with helping this child think about a recipe and proportions or ratios because they were so excited to teach their other fourth graders. So I wonder if we use technology to teach the content of kids, regardless of their context, or how do we let the kids flourish where they're living at home? Say, hey, I want to bring in my context. I like to eat this. I like to drink this. And now I'm sharing part of me, my life, with math and English. We may get too focused on technology of a way to just give kids access to what I think is important, this content, versus bringing the kids and their families into the context of learning.
Great, super. We have a couple more questions. So one of the questions that has come up for my peer group in my neighborhood with my daughter's school is, what are some of the best assessment practices that you're aware of or that you see in distance learning? And this person wants to know, because they maybe have a middle school math, if you can get that specific. But what are some of the good assessment practices you're seeing around the state or in the county or across the nation for distance learning?
I'm sure Paul, with his work at the county, has maybe more specific answers, or Jay, because he's an expert in this area. But certainly seeing people, innovate, flip grids, videos. I remember when we used to, before smartboards, remember when we had those mini whiteboards where we do instant checks in the classroom? We'd give the students some problem to solve. They put up their whiteboards. We're looking right there. We're providing intervention. We're reteaching. I mean, instant. We can do those kinds of things through technology, through Zoom. All of those things are still approachable, and they're kind of fun. We're doing team building for AXA, a 2-hour virtual team building. Who knew that was ever going to be a thing? And we're using a video app to record ourselves doing goofy things, and we upload it for everyone to see. So there are ways to innovate and do this. I'd be curious what Jay has seen, you know, kind of more research-based methods. But
if I may add to that, I think it goes back to, at least for me, the most effective, and what Jay was talking about, our teacher teams working with support from principal. I mean, one thing the research shows over and over again is common assessments matter. That's how we have a framework and a guide to understanding how a third grade classroom is performing in one school, within the school, or somewhere else. I don't know why we've ever gotten away from that, because that's where I've seen the biggest bang for our buck, is when we have common assessments as a district. And it doesn't have to be something that's packaged or through a publisher. That's part of the art of, I think, developing teachers, is getting that team, those grade level teams together, talking about what performance targets make the most sense, that are high level, that we want all our kids to do. How are we going to measure it? Maybe bring some in from here and there, but then how you respond to those common assessments periodically to check how your kids are doing and what type of support you're bringing in underneath. The research has been clear on that for years. Why we've gotten away from it, I have no idea. But if we don't have that in place, I think we're missing the boat.
Yeah, I think that we can agree with you both more. We could go down the path of like diagnostic assessments that are most widely used in, you know, benchmark assessments and platforms. But I'm going to just advocate for what Paul, you mentioned, is I think formative assessments is going to be the key. And I would say almost authentic assessment. So how do you get students to produce something that through their production shows you what they inherently understand they can do? And so we may have to rethink assessment versus I want to assess learning to like screens kids to see whether they understand all these standards. Great, that's a number. Or I want to see if students can produce this and do this. And by analyzing deeply their cognitive ability and their application of skills, yeah, it might take some more time, but boy, what great insights I'd have. And that might be a shift in thinking, because we could do an assessment right now amongst all of us, right? You're asking us questions and we're being judged on our quality of our response. So an authentic assessment of how well we're responding.
Wow. Well, I really want to thank our panelists today, Wes Smith, Paul Gothold, and Jay Westover, for giving us over an hour of their time and their expertise, their collective expertise and wisdom, particularly in one of the most significant times in the history of education, not just in the United States, but the world. Really appreciate your thoughts. More importantly, I appreciate the work that each of you do every day for children in our state and in your communities. It means a lot, not just to those parents, but it means a lot to the future of our state and our country. So for that, I thank you. USC is very, very proud to have hosted this and to have you be part of that. And with that, I'd like to return it back to Matt DeGroosh.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you to our panelists. I'd like to thank you all too as well for reconvening today to share updated information from our first webinar in April. Who knows, we may need to have another follow-up session again in a few months at the way things are going. So thank you again. As I mentioned earlier, a recording of today's webinar will be sent out in the next few days. And when you close out of today's webinar, a short survey will appear. Please take a moment to provide feedback on today's webinar and share your ideas for future virtual programs. Thank you for attending. We hope you will attend a future Leadership Month session. Have a great day and fight on.
Fight on, Jay.
Jay, it won't hurt you to do